Recording in progress.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for joining the National Network for Justice in discussion with Professor Kristin Henning. I am really excited that Kristen agreed to do this with us today. I've known her for many years, and we've probably only met in person maybe 2 times, but
Right.
I feel like I know her because I see her all over the place and, different events. And she's just an amazing advocate on behalf of juveniles, and was really excited when this book came out and she agreed to speak to us. And we had a little bit of scheduling difficulties because everybody was clamoring, but we got her today, and we're so excited. So Kristen Henning is the Bloom Professor of Law and director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at Georgetown Law, where she and her law students represent youth accused of delinquency in Washington, D.C. Chris has trained state actors across the country on the impact of racial bias and trauma in the juvenile and criminal legal systems. Her workshops help stakeholders recognize their own biases and develop strategies to counter them. Chris also worked closely with the MacArthur's Foundation's Juvenile Indigent Defense Action Network to develop a 41-volume juvenile training immersion program, a national training curriculum for juvenile defenders. In 2019, Chris partnered with the National Juvenile Defender Center to launch a racial justice toolkit for advocates, and again in 2020 to launch the Ambassador for Racial Justice Program, a year-long program for juvenile defenders committed to challenging racial injustice in the juvenile legal system through litigation and systemic reform. She's won several awards, including the 2021 Juvenile Leadership Prize by the Juvenile Law. So Kristen, welcome to our discussion. I'm honored, as I said. I want to start off with just asking you, what was your compelling reason for writing this book? You start and end with a story about a client, Eric, and you have stories about some of your other clients and many more whose names we recognize as hashtags, unfortunately. But was it your years as a juvenile defender, as a trainer, a combination of those things that really compelled you to want to write this book?
Yeah, so first, I just have to say, right back at you, the honor is all mine. Thank you, Angela, for inviting me into your space. I love it. I love all that you're doing. So thank you. But yes, so this book is really, for me, a reaction to what it's like to represent children for 25, almost 26 years in the nation's capital, right? And in that entire time, I've only had 4 white children as my clients. That is like statistically impossible. It just is, right? So it leads you to believe either that there are no white kids in the nation's capital, or that white kids don't commit crime, and neither one of those would be true. So after 26 years, really, of just engaging with young Black children who are there, and in your heart, in your experience, in your observations, that white kids are committing the same types of behavior, engaging the same types of behaviors, and we never see them in court. So I think for me, it was almost just like a moment, a wake-up call, an aha moment. So that's part of it. I really wanted the world to see what was happening on the ground level. I think the other thing is what you said, Angela. It's the clients that I represent and my deep desire to tell their stories. So the book starts with Eric, it ends with Eric, and then all of the clients that I've represented in between. I wanted to give voice to their reality, to the trauma, for one, that they experience in the legal system, the trauma they experience being criminalized, not just by police officers in a blue uniform, but also walking through the streets and feeling criminalized and targeted by civilians, folks who don't look like them, and to be quite frank with you, folks who also look like them. And so those are two of the main reasons. A smaller reason is, there's a book edited by Angela Davis called Policing the Black Man. And I have a chapter in that book. And at the end of writing that chapter, is a short, 25-page chapter, I said to myself, this is a whole book. And it was called Boys to Men, the legal socialization of Black children. And really, that's sort of an academic title. I didn't want to write an academic book. I wanted to write a book that everyone could understand and grapple with, and really begin to understand what our Black children are experiencing today. So.
Yeah, no, that is so on point where you talk about boys to men, and you talk about the disparities and the numbers. There's a you go through the book and you talk about some of the statistics, but one of the statistics that stood out to me was you talked about the disparities of the percentages of arrest and incarceration of Black kids versus white kids. And an example you give is that Black kids make up 16% of the population, yet 50% of the arrests for violent crime and 42% of property crime. I'm curious though, as from someone, let's say someone is a crime survivor, right? Perspective.
Right,
they don't really care if it was a Black person or a white person that committed the offense against them, whatever it was, whether it was a violent offense or if it was a property offense. They just feel offended, right? They just feel they're victimized, and they want to see something happen. So what is your argument for people who say, well, we should just throw them in jail, throw these young people in jail. It doesn't matter. They should know better. What do you say to critics who would say, or to a crime survivor, a victim of crime, like what is your remedy to rectify that?
Yeah, it's such a beautiful question, and it's a hard question. And so I always start with the notion of, people want to go to violent crime and victimization, and I'm all, I'm there for it. And I, my heart goes out to people who've been victimized. I, too, have lost and, been a victim of crime, and we want it to stop. We all want to live in safe neighborhoods and go about our business. But there are several layers that I think we should pull apart. I think one of those layers is that we in our society live with this, we've bought into this notion that the only way to create public safety, right, is through traditional law enforcement methods, right? So traditional policing, incarceration. And we seem to forget that there are numerous more effective strategies for public safety. So one, the overarching framework has got to be a public health approach to public safety, okay? Which means, understanding the root causes, the psychology behind criminal behavior, developing systems. We're almost starting at the end game, which what are the solutions to all of this? But a public health approach to public safety is attentive to the relationships between children and adults. It is racially equitable. It is restorative. And this is the key piece that goes to an actual victim of an actual victim of a crime. A public health approach to public safety is all about restoration, restoring relationships after conflict or after harm, and then it's trauma informed. So those are the four sort of pillars, I would argue, of a public health approach. And so if I'm an individual victim, right, or if I'm speaking to an individual victim, I want to talk about restorative justice, right? I know they want accountability, but restorative justice doesn't relieve accountability. It just focuses on, how do we repair the harm to the victim? How do we repair societal factors that led the child to that criminal conduct? And so I get it. And I think, we do have to talk about the serious crime and victimization, but I hope that people will be open to alternative responses to crime, right? That don't buy into the traditional framework. The other reason why, the other thing I think I would say to a victim of crime is, a victim of crime doesn't want to be the next victim, right? And so the next victim, so what do we do to make sure that that child who committed that crime doesn't perpetuate or doesn't perpetrate a crime again in the future? And one of the important ways is to ensure the well-being of that young person. So then it's about rehabilitation and restoring that child, providing supports for that child so that they don't commit crime again in the future. And I think what we don't know in our society, and what I try to get people to see, is that our strategy for the over-policing, hyper-surveillance, and criminalization of Black children actually does us as a society more harm than good, right? Mm-hmm. Nobody is actually any safer. The public isn't safer, individuals aren't safer, police aren't safer, and the child isn't safer. There is research demonstrating that when we over-police, we overcompensate through these traditional law enforcement methods, we actually increase crime instead of reducing crime, right? So incarcerating children, throwing them away, locking up the key is absolutely the worst thing that we can do to a young person during their adolescent development years, if we don't want any further victimization. So I think some of it is about education. Some of it is about funding for meaningful alternatives for policing, and convincing or helping victims of crime understand that there are alternatives, and that we will use them, and that we will engage the victim in restorative responses that seek to make them whole to the extent that's possible, but that don't simultaneously destroy the child in the meantime.
Yeah, I completely agree. We tend to see kids, and we've heard all of the stories, or the research about the brain development, but outside of that, kids are going to be kids, right? Kids do stupid things.
Right.
We were kids once and did stupid things. When I think about some of the stupid things I did, not necessarily criminal, as they say, criminal, but without full thought processes, right? There are things that we just did as kids. And one of the things that you talked about previous was the bias that exists, right? And so it's bias, having a police officer or someone in authority looking at a Black child differently than they would a white child. Right. But that bias you mentioned in the book also extends to Black people and how Black people see young Black children.
Right.
So could you talk a little bit about just that overarching concept and theme of Black people? There was a story I think you mentioned about the young Black boy that was in the backseat of a car with two white women driving.
Yes.
And this was in the Midwest, and a couple called the police because they thought that the women were under duress, which I don't understand why you would think these two women were under duress if they were not given any signals that they were under duress.
Right.
I guess this person thought that they were being held maybe with a gun or something, and it come to find out that it was the grandson of one of the white women who were in the front of the seat. Like, okay, there's biracial families. They could have been picking him up from school or church and taking him somewhere. A whole plethora of things could have been involved in that scenario, not necessarily a crime taking place. So talk a little bit about the implicit bias that we have as individuals, as white people, as Black people. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's amazing how so deeply embedded our implicit biases are that even within the same race, right, we see these biases playing out. And so I always like to situate the biases that we have. The implicit biases originated intentionally. And so I always look backwards, at least to remind us that historically, in our country, we have a long history of failing to see Black children as children, right? And so obviously from the era of slavery, Black children were perceived to be the property of the purported master. We get to the civil rights era, and you've got an Emmett Till who can be sacrificed at the age of 15, who can be lynched, 14, sorry, who can be lynched at the age of 14, really to make a symbolic statement that that we will not integrate schools, that we will not allow our Black children to integrate schools, because Emmett Till was lynched on the, at the tail end or in the heart of the fight for integration. But in order to justify these horrific encounters, slavery, the lynching of Emmett Till, we then have to demonize Black children in quite intentional ways. So white America intentionally portrayed children like Emmett Till as a threat to America. And in Emmett Till's case, a threat to white women in particular. The reason why I start there is because those narratives were planted in our country quite intentionally in an effort to support, right, maintain the status quo and to support the power and influence of white America, to be quite frank. But even after that, in the 80s and the 90s, when we saw a temporary uptick in crime, politicians then began to manipulate race and crime to their own advantage, to their own political advantage. Again, in some very intentional ways, the super predator myth, right? Which is a pseudo-scientific myth that Black children were gonna run amok in our country, take over the country and kill, maim, and steal from us all. Those were, again, intentional narratives that got perpetuated. So then we're left, even as the super predator myth is disproven, even after we have managed, at least by law, maybe not in practice, by law, to integrate our country, those myths still lie in the American psyche. So that's what I go back when I talk about implicit bias. It is those fears that were so deeply embedded in our country that we cannot shake. Right. And so now what you see, in the 90s and beyond is the media capitalizing on that and really portraying Black children as dangerous. And so now white people, Black people, Asian Americans, all ethnic groups, you walk through a park and you see a group of Black kids, you're afraid. Right? That's even within the same race. And we have to ask ourselves why that is, right? In part, I think it's because of that intentional narrative that we have. Where do these implicit biases come from, right? These stereotypes and assumptions and fears that we have about Black children. And they're deeply embedded and they go hard. There's so much research out there. And I try to talk about it in a very plain language throughout the book, the ways in which we are more likely to interpret it, ambiguous facial expressions, ambiguous behaviors by Black children as dangerous and threatening when we don't perceive those facial expressions to be dangerous at all. Among white children, there are studies showing that we perceive Black children in groups as dangerous. Whereas we see white kids in groups, we don't see them as dangerous. There's research showing that we look at a Black child and we see them as 4.5 years or more older than they actually are. So they look stronger, bigger, more mature, less innocent. And that's true for girls. And let's be clear that my book talks about girls as well as boys, about Black boys. But so I'll stop there to say the implicit biases are really deeply embedded and they impact us within the same race.
Yeah, no doubt. One of the first examples that I probably had, and many people may have had, was watching Boys in the Hood and seeing the police officer come to the house where there was just a gunshot fired through the door. Right. And the Black police officer, is basically saying, well, did you catch him? Knowing that it was probably a Black person because they're living in a Black community. And just the bias that the Black officer had, as opposed to, he showed that it wasn't even the white person that had the bias, the white police officer, right. Black police officer that had the bias. When you talk about that overall arching theme of the bias and kids being seen, Black kids being seen as being older, of course, it brings to mind young Tamir Rice, who, was shot because he had what someone called the police to say it was probably a toy, but was shot within seconds of the police arriving on the scene before they even decided to say, what are you doing? You know, put your hands up, or
Right.
even put your hands out, let me see your hands, anything. Like nothing was said to this kid. And uh, they said that they thought that he was older. Of course, you know,
Right.
he's older, and that he was a threat. And then they lied and said all this stuff, and not realizing, okay, there's cameras everywhere.
Right. Right. Right.
So even after you lie, you still, you know, are holding this, that he looked older. There was miscommunication,
Yep.
you know, in terms of the dispatcher saying what the person who called in said, and then treating the family as if they were criminals for
Horribly.
coming
Yeah.
to the aid of this little boy. So that to me was really striking. I found the book to be heartbreaking,
Mm-hmm.
heart-wrenching,
Mm-hmm.
and the way that you interwove the personal stories and the statistics and the policies that we have implemented, you know, depending on whether or not the kid, depending on how we charge children, like
Right.
15 versus 16 in some jurisdictions.
Right.
You talked about the Central Park Five, now the exonerated five, and just how they were processed through the system.
Right.
And we know that that is happening. It continues to happen today. Maybe not to that level, but kids are being questioned without having a guardian, and kids are being, you know, transferred to adult courts. And so, talk a little bit about just you as a public defender and what you went through. And just, you said you only had like 5 clients that were white, you know, all of these other clients that you saw coming in shackles and chains.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about trying to defend based on all of the things that we have to deal with, right? The biases, the
Yeah.
crime that was committed, whether or not the jury sees these kids as juveniles based on whatever it is that they were said to have done. Talk
Yeah.
a little bit about doing, you know,
That
being
work.
important, doing that work.
Yeah, so a couple of things. One, I really want to be clear. I still represent children, so I'm still in DC Superior Court representing kids, and this stuff is contemporary. The cases that I talk about are contemporary, unless I note in the book that it's an older case that I had. And really, as I said earlier, I have been representing children for 26 years, and there are so many layers, again, that we could talk about. One of which is that defenders have to be careful not to become complicit in the system, right? So we are the ones that are hired or appointed, you know, when, you know, public defenders. So I started off at the DC Public Defender Service and then went to Georgetown. But defenders are appointed to stand in the gap between the child and the state, right? But it is really sort of jarring to think about or to even contemplate the idea that a defense attorney might have implicit bias. But if I didn't say so earlier, let's be clear, we all have it. We all have it. And
Right.
so part of what happens when you do the work for so long, and particularly in a city like Washington, D.C., where truly I'm telling you, like every child you see, it's not just my docket, that comes through that courthouse is African-American. We even have very, very few Latinx American children that come through the courthouse, and almost zero white children, really. And so you become complicit in it, and you focus on the law and the legality, the motions, your efforts to throw out the evidence. And so you dig in as a defense attorney, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And that's what you're focused on, right? You're focused on winning that one case within the legal parameters, whether it's self-defense, innocent presence, accident. And the reason why I say all that is, it is not until you force yourself to step back and say, wait a minute, I live in Washington, D.C., and I only see Black children, right? Where's everybody else? Or if I step outside that courthouse, right, and I look around me and there are white children and white adults everywhere in the city, why don't I see them inside this little hole that we've created called our Superior Court? Why is that, right? And so, but you have to do that work. You have to be intentional. So I just want to say that even me, a Black woman, Early in your career, you're learning how to be a good lawyer. And we're not always thinking about those social justice macro issues. So I think that's a moment of confession for all of us, okay, who work in the same way in the child welfare system. You just do the work and you don't think about it. And then, you have a moment where I can't do it anymore. Without asking the hard questions or out wanting to blow it up. And so for me, I'll just tell you the story. For me, I mean, there were a number of moments that were real aha moments, but that story about Eric, which opens the book, is truly that. I represented Eric, who was accused of possession of a Molotov cocktail and attempted arson in DC Superior Court. And this is a child, literally a 13-year-old boy, who on a Saturday night is pouring, who's watching a movie, and he sees somebody making a Molotov cocktail. He says in his 13-year-old mind, I want to make something that looks like that. He begins to grab liquids from the kitchen. He grabs a glass bottle. He pours it all together. He closes up the bottle, and he grabs a piece of toilet paper to hang outside the bottle to make it look like a wick. You and I know that's not going to be a wick, right? It's going to burn out before it even reaches the cap. So he puts it in his book bag. He goes to school. His mom drives him to school on Monday morning. He forgets the bottle is in his book bag, and a school resource officer grabs the bottle and says, or grabs the bag and says, what is this in your bag? He says, that is nothing. You can throw it away. My client, Eric, goes on to class. Little did he know that is the beginning of a 9-month ordeal where literally we are calling expert witnesses, trying to fight this case, trying to convince everybody that this is not going to be flammable, just hours and hours of work on this case and witnesses and hearings on this case. For really what was 13-year-old adolescent behavior with a bunch of liquids that was never going to blow up. He didn't look it up. He didn't research it. So how does this tie into, what is it? When is your wake-up call as a defender about the injustices in the system? So I go to Connecticut, and I'm giving a talk in Connecticut at a conference. And I share Eric's story at that conference. And this was just shortly after I had been representing Eric. And a white woman comes up to me and she says, my son did the exact same thing. He attempted to make a Molotov cocktail and he took it to school. And so I say to her, well, what happened? Well, what did she tell me? She says, they put him in advanced science classes, chemistry class, an advanced science class instead. How radically different. So that was one of many of my absolute aha moments, that this system that we're living in is so exceedingly skewed against Black children. Right. And so that was a wake-up call. I think there were several, and you could see some of them in the book that were wake-up calls. And so you asked me, what does that mean to be as a defender? So I then became very intentional about raising race, litigating race and racial bias in my cases, or in particular, litigating what it means, so for example, I don't know how many lawyers are listening in, but for example, the police officers say when a child runs away from the police, that is evidence that they're guilty. And so we began to push back on that. Like, that's absurd. If a Black child runs away from the police, it's because they're afraid of being the next Tamir Rice, the next Eric Garner, right? The next Mike Brown. That's why they run. And so we begin to litigate some of these issues and really draw to the court's attention racial trauma, and what that means and what impact that has. And what flight means, and what legal questions like seizure means. We begin to educate judges. Like, we take it for granted that we can walk through the streets without undue intrusion by the police. That's not a reality for Black kids, and it should be under the law. The law says that they are entitled. So we begin to litigate that. So that's some of what it looks like when you become aware. So first is a recognition and a commitment to taking it on, and it's hard. Angela, like when you start raising these issues, your judges push back. They're resistant. How dare you call me racist? And even Black judges, like, nobody's calling you racist. We're just trying to help you see that race is relevant to all of these legal questions in the system. Yeah. So
and the inability for a lot of people to see that it is race, the unwillingness for judges and other attorneys to see this race. And I personally don't think that they don't see it. I just think that they are captured in the processes of the law. And so because of that, right, they just, well, this is the law.
That's right. I mean, the number of times somebody said, or like even prosecutors will say, well, no, I just prosecute the cases that the police officers bring to me. Or judges say, well, I just adjudicate within the bounds of the law, like you said, whatever the statute says, whatever the definition is, without thinking about these broader questions. And I think we just get caught up, and we have to stop and look at it.
Right, right. So let me ask you, you mentioned something in the book, and I remember when I had done, I was working on some reports for NACDL when I worked for NACDL, yeah. And there was a tweet that came out, criming while white, and I had never heard of that.
Yes.
I had never heard of that before, yes. And I said, wow, this sounds like We Are All Criminals. I don't know if you.
Right. I do. I have that book. If you look behind me, it's on my shelf. Yes.
And I said, this is that, right? That it is a recognition from white people that some of the things that you did as a child or even as an adult, some of those things would be criminal if a Black person were to do them, and has landed Black people in prison for a long time, at least arrested, sent to jail, sent to prisons. And so I'm just curious, when you put that in your book, and then I went to We Are All Criminals, and I think everyone should definitely look at not only your book, but look at We Are Criminals as well.
Yes.
Because the things that folks say that they got away with as white kids, white people, is astonishing.
Absolutely.
Because we know that Black kids have been killed for less.
Absolutely.
Have been killed for less. And so when you saw that tweet originally, what came to you? What came to you when you saw that? Well, and we are criminals, because I think We Are Criminals must have come out before that tweet.
Look, I never get up in the middle of a Zoom, but I had to, because I agree with you. Everybody should get this book, right? We actually had her come to, I teach at Georgetown Law School, and I've done conferences, race-related conferences on the juvenile legal system. So we invited her to come and speak and talk about this project that she did. But that's absolutely, right. So you asked the question, so how did I react when I saw that tweet, that hashtag,
Mm-hmm.
So I got to tell you, I wasn't the one who saw it. My aunt saw it, right? So my aunt, they've all known that I'm really passionate about, race and justice. And, I've been writing this book for like 3.5, maybe 4 years. And it was pretty, early on when I was writing the book, and my aunt, sent me a text. She's like, have you seen this? And indeed, it was like, criming while right. And it is truly, seeing it. It's part of what I want to do with the book, is to convince people that we're not making this up. People, I really believe, think that all violent crime is committed by Black kids, and that all crime is violent. That's the other thing, right? Those are two, separate points, and that just white kids don't do it, or that when they do it, it's just kids being kids. Boys will be boys, let the girls experiment and test. And it's received and accepted as a normal part of adolescent development, this impulsivity, sensation seeking, risk taking, all the things that we know teenagers do that we did when you said earlier, that we do as teenagers. And it's considered almost a rite of passage for white kids. Think about going to college, all the things that white fraternities and sororities do, drinking and, rape. I mean, we hear about it in the news, right? Supreme Court justices accused of, rape, and the response is boys will be boys. It's white boys will be boys, right? It's not, it's not boys will be boys. It's white boys will be boys, because they're allowed to.
They're allowed to be boys.
That's right. That's a privilege, right? And we think about, just think about college as that space in which, more than any other space, kids run wild, and it's just really considered a rite of passage. And so what we talk about is the ways in which our society goes out of its way to forgive adolescent crime when it involves white children. And I give some stories. I wanted to set the book up. The book is a book about the criminalization of Black children, but I have to start it off with talking about the ways in which white kids do the same thing. So I do that with stats and the like, but then I bring in some of the most high profile stories that we've heard about white crime. And how did we as a society respond? Do y'all remember the story about the Ethan Couch, who was the affluenza defense? Just the craziest story. You know, he literally does what any teenager wants to do. Parents are gone. He wants to throw a party, so he does, right? He runs out of alcohol for his teenage party. So he jumps in his truck and drives to the local Walmart, buys beer with a false ID, gets back in the car, and then they kill 4 people, right? You know, drunk driving, and injure 9 other people. And what was the response? The response is, you know, oh, the defense theory was, well, he's so wealthy, he's never been taught boundaries, right? And so we have to forgive him. He ultimately gets, you know, found guilty and gets a residential, or like his parents pay for some residential services, those kinds of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, we hear about the kid, I don't remember if you remember from out west, the kid who was a part of the gang, Cameron Terrell, and an innocent bystander or innocent person gets killed in a gang shooting. And his defense theory was, what? I was just studying gang culture. I wasn't really a part of the gang. And people went out of their way to believe that ridiculous story. The 2 Black kids get convicted, right? And then he gets not guilty for that. And so there's examples after examples of the ways in which, you know, white kids do some really serious things. I like to equate, people talk about gangs all the time. One of the most notorious gangs are college fraternities and sororities. Those are gangs, right? The police department, I don't mean this to be my book is not meant to be an anti-police book, but I mean, you think about what the federal definition of gangs are, right? If you look at the different criteria, and it includes, you know, much of the activity, unlawful activity of so many, you know, fraternities, sororities, police departments, and the like. But, you know, it's just not treated or viewed in the same way.
In the same way. Yeah. I completely agree when you're talking about the book is not about the police. It is about bias, and it is about the way that we all look at young Black boys, but also girls, you suggest in here. It's just that the interaction has been with, right, law enforcement,
Yep.
that you see more, that it is more on the news, and there's more video of those instances, right, where Black people, and all of the stories that you have in your book, I can only imagine how many more hundreds of more that don't make, right, the national news. Absolutely. Or even the local news, because absolutely, if not for video, right, if not for video, where would we be in terms of George Floyd? If not for video,
we wouldn't be here. We probably wouldn't even be having like this conversation. And, you know, I'm getting so much, you know, a number of like invitations to come and speak about the book. I can pretty much assure you that it would have gone straight under the radar, but for some of these high profile incidents involving George Floyd, Adam Toledo, who's a Latino boy, Makia Bryant, the 9-year-old from New York who was pepper sprayed, the 9-year-old Black girl who was pepper sprayed. I mean, just in the last, you know, year to 18 months. I mean, it's just really, we shouldn't have to be having this conversation, but I'm right with you. I'm actually, you know, I don't even want to say there's a benefit, but it is the fact that these issues have made the national news that allow us to tell these stories. But I got to tell you, it's every single day, even in my caseload. Somebody asked me once, well, how in the world did you figure out which stories to include? Because there's so many. And right now I have a number of young people, right? High school students or students who are freshmen and sophomores in college reading the book. And I got to tell you, I mean, just this morning, the number of emails that I get from young people saying, this reminds me of my experience, and this reminds me of my experience. It's just the stories. They're just too many to tell, but it's every day.
Yes. Yeah. I want to go into the chat a little bit. I see people posting things. One, Daphne posted that the 7th anniversary of Tamir Rice's death is on the 22nd. So blessings out to her family. Jordan, oh, I want to say it's Jordan
Davis or Edwards, right?
I know,
Exactly.
right? Jordan Davis.
Uh-huh.
So the anniversary of his death is coming up because he died Black Friday.
Oh, that's
He
right.
was
That's
killed Black
right.
Friday.
Yes,
So
yes,
I
yes.
just wanted to acknowledge
Right.
that. I
Absolutely.
had had his mom and dad at a
Yes.
screening we did of the film
Yes.
Florida several years ago, and interviewed them. That it just heart wrenching
Right.
stories. All of the stories are just, horrible
Absolutely.
stories. And there's another gentleman, Bruce Johnson. And Bruce, I would love to have you just I think if you raise your hand, I might be able to put you on so you could, because you wrote a huge thing in the chat. But he asked about, did you write about class in your book, but also um, talked about the poor preying on the poor. And if you want to, talk about that a little bit. I never covered a white youth arrested in DC, and I never covered a poor white person unless they were homeless with mental issues. Everyone wants more preventative measures. Finally, there are class issues at play here too. Affluent Black kids rarely appear in DC juvenile court. Did you write about class in your book? And she does. And Bruce has a book coming out, and Bruce, I know I'm going to interview you, hopefully. So yeah, if you want to talk anything about that, class issues that you mentioned, poor preying upon the poor and poor. I think there was another story in the book about a young man who was he at Yale College, and oh my gosh, I might be mixing up the stories. I know there was one where there was the young white guy who was found having sex with a unconscious girl.
Oh, right. That's at Stanford. Right, right.
Okay.
Brock. Yes. But the difference between Marcus Dixon, right, and I'm drawing a blank also on his name, Brock from Stanford, who was accused of rape, right? And he gets minimal jail time. Marcus Dixon gets tried as an adult. Brock was already an adult, but gets tried as an adult and sentenced to 10 years in Georgia, right? So that's one of the older cases that we know about for having sex with an underage girl, a white girl in Georgia. But I talk a lot about I have a whole section dedicated to particularly the fears that we have about Black children and Black sexuality, right? That's like the worst crime of all crimes is sexual deviance, but it's the presumptions of sexual deviance. So with regard to Bruce's question, thank you so much, actually, both for being here and for your questions. I mean, these are I think the class questions are important questions, and I do address class, right? Because I'm educated middle class Black woman, and one of the things that I say about race and class is that really the implicit biases that we see do not spare upper class or wealthy Black folks from criminal engagement. And so I often say that there are very few Black families, that I know that are not touched in some way, at least tangentially by the criminal legal system, right? Whether it be a cousin, whatever. And in my situation, it's multiple, right? Like my own brother, ultimately, I hope you'll, read the book. So I don't want to, give too much away, but my brother died in prison, right? And I talk about the ways in which our middle class upbringing and our middle class existence did not shield my brother, my family from those disparate treatment in the criminal legal system. That's not to say my brother was, didn't do anything wrong, or my cousins didn't do anything wrong, but the ways in which society responds and the system responds, so that yes, it is true that context does matter, and growing up in a wealthier neighborhood will in some ways reduce your contact with law enforcement and reduce the risk of violence and all those things. We know that, right? But what I say in my book is when my brother stepped outside of our neighborhood and walked down the street, nobody knows he came from a privileged background. Nobody knows that he was educated. Nobody knows that he went to college, right? Nobody knows that, right? Because he's got a Black face. And so class does matter, and it does increase I talk a lot in the book about the trauma of growing up in a Black urban or poor neighborhood that is over policed or with tremendous police surveillance. So that is a story in itself within the book, right? But beyond that, the race piece is important, and it can't be disentangled from what we're talking about in the criminal legal system. And so, and yes, Bruce, I do know my brother, younger brother, Kyle, is indeed speaks very, very highly of you. So I do hope we get to meet Bruce. But yes, Kyle and I, our older brother, died in prison, and so I really do. I focus on the ways in which class doesn't prevent that, right?
Right.
It makes it
Right.
worse. But I do say, right, in the book, I also say, though, I am very clear that poverty makes it worse in so many different ways. And so one of the ways is that I talk about in the book is my client's family who got evicted, right, who got evicted from public housing as a result of a criminal conviction of one of the children in the house, right? That is a function, that is a collateral consequence that is only available to someone who's poor and lives in or depends upon public housing. So it's a really good question about class, really good question.
Yeah, yeah. Latanya says she saw this on display when LeBron James' house was spray painted with the racial slurs, "Money doesn't protect you from racism." This is very, very true. And we've heard of athletes being pulled over, and it's not until they are recognized or they get to jail and they realize, okay, you've arrested this person for what offense? And not to say that person didn't do anything, right? Maybe they changed lanes and didn't turn the signal on, or or if they were drinking or whatever the case is. But the treatment is definitely disparate, and having money doesn't shield you from being Black.
Absolutely. Skip Gates, right? The classic story, right?
Yes.
Skip Gates, arrested trying to go into his house with the key.
Right.
Whatever he's doing. I don't remember that key or not. But the point is, he's at his front door.
He's at his front door, but he doesn't belong there. And the privilege is what that was about, right? That you are in a neighborhood and you don't really look like you should be here. Right. That you should be here. So I want to read a couple things from your book, because I think that they get to the heart of, one is about whiteness, and then the other is about what you just talked about in terms of trauma. This is regarding Michael Dunn, who killed Jordan Davis, and you write, much like the vigilantes of the 19th and early 20th centuries, Michael Dunn killed Jordan to protect a valued interest, whiteness. Being white, looking white, and sometimes even aligning oneself with whiteness have value worth protecting. In the most tangible sense, whiteness carries with it certain legal, social, financial, and political advantages that arise from increased access to the workforce, marketplace, academy, and residential spaces. But whiteness also has a psychic value, a feeling of superiority that comes from the reputation and status of being or aligning with whites. And I thought that was so poignant, because it basically puts it right there in black and white, no pun intended, that whiteness offers a certain privilege.
Right.
And as we've seen with racial reckoning after George Floyd, whiteness comes with certain privilege. Right. And you did not have to have slaves, right, to benefit from what happened.
Right.
The economic, the social, the political happenings that we're dealing with right now. Just because there's an Oprah, just because there's a Michael Jordan, just because there's a LeBron, just because there's
Barack
Obama, does not mean that racism doesn't exist in this country. And it doesn't mean that we're immune from it, or me being a Black woman, my friends being white women, that I tell them all the time. I say, bees, if something happens to me and I come up missing, you better get on CNN and start crying your eyes out. And they know it. They know it because, and we've seen this, right? In the most recent case of the young woman who just got all of this press, right? Because she was this white woman, and there are all these black people that come up missing, and they get no recognition.
Right,
So
right.
talk a little bit about that whiteness, that
Yeah,
privilege of being white, of
right, right.
being white, right?
Yeah,
And the white supremacy and the white superiority that this gentleman thought, well, they are playing this rap music
right. The entitlement.
and they're invading my space, even though they were there playing the music before he got there, before he pulled into the station. Still,
Yeah.
you should not be playing this music. It is disturbing me. And so something that is disturbing me, you can't do
Yeah,
as a
exactly.
young black kid.
And you know, when you hear him in the after Michael Dunn, in the aftermath of killing, you know, Jordan Davis, I mean, he's adamant and entrenched in his belief that they were bad. I mean, his language, even on, you know, he places phone calls. He calls his girlfriend who was with him at the time. So he's in jail, he's locked up, and he's still using language like they were thugs. Where are their fathers, right? You know, why don't they pull up their pants? Why do they listen to that gangster rap? Like the whole, so it's part of it is that implicit bias, the assumptions that I have. But more than that, right? It is exactly what you say. It's the deep-seated sense of entitlement that just comes even, you know, to I think oftentimes even some of the most well-meaning white folks who are allies, right? But there's some sense of entitlement. I can do this justice work, but don't come live in my space, right? Don't come live in my neighborhood, or one or two of you can live in my neighborhood, but all y'all can't come, right? There's that tipping point thing, right? Or
Yes.
I would never live in, you know, a predominantly Black neighborhood. So there's these barriers that we set up for ourselves, particularly around our school, you know, and I'm speaking, you know, even of white friends that I sit around and who are honest and willing to have these conversations. Like, will you send your child to a public school system, right? As a white person, you know, or do I want them in, you know, my private schools, taking my money out of the state system, that kind of thing. Will I live in a neighborhood that's integrated? Like, so how far will I go to advance justice? And so I think there are limits there that are allowed to white folks from the place of privilege, right? And it spills over into what you see with Michael Dunn. I mean, he's a little, you know, in some ways, I think he's an outlier because he's so vocal and so entrenched, but he's not that much of an outlier in light of what we saw January 6th,
right?
You know, at the nation.
Definitely not.
Right?
Definitely
so, not. Right, it's just, you know, it's that sense of entitlement and privilege, and I can be at the White House. I can show up at the White House, but if Black kids, I mean, what was so devastating as I was sitting at my computer, my TV that day, watching this unfold. And I'm like, if any Black child, I wanted to get on my phone and call every single one of my Black clients and say, don't go down there. Whatever you do, don't leave your house, don't do anything, because you would have gotten shot and you would have gone to jail. That was my immediate reaction as a defense attorney. You know, but it is a real privilege to go and show up at the White House and protest. Right. Black Lives Matter shows up and it's like, you know, it's terror.
Scaling the walls. That they wouldn't have gotten as far as the door and the windows. Just scaling the walls would have gotten you shot.
Absolutely.
Beat down, maced, whatever.
Absolutely. And we wouldn't even gotten that far because all of the security, the perimeter. I mean, I live here in Washington, D.C., and I know some of the people on the, you know, on the call do. How difficult when they know something is coming.
Exactly.
Oh my God, the perimeter is tight. You're not getting anywhere near there, but they were allowed to. The last thing I'll say, because you referenced Michael Dunn, I think really the story that really paints this notion of white privilege and what it means, the value of whiteness, the privilege of whiteness, is in the Zimmerman case. It's George Zimmerman who killed Trayvon Martin. So what, you know, George Zimmerman obviously is not white, but his skin, the whiteness of his skin, right, allowed him a privilege and caused him to align himself with his white neighbors in this effort to protect, right, this gated community, right? And that really, and really it's worth, you know, reading about, but really what's going on in that community at that time, it's shifting, right? And it's that tipping point. More and more Black people are moving into the neighborhood as the economy crashes, right? And the housing market crashes. People are buying into that. And so you know, with your white skin, you know, align yourself with your neighbors and keeping it's this notion of who do I align myself with and who do I subordinate in order to keep my status and my privilege. And so, you know, I just think the Zimmerman story paints it even more, even though he wasn't, you know, white.
Wasn't white. Well, yeah, visually white and was culturally not necessarily.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have two more questions for you. Yeah. And I really am so pleased that you are here and spending time with us and going through the book and all of the different themes. But one of the things that struck me when I was reading was I remember the director of the CDC talking about racism is a serious threat to public health.
Yeah.
Right. And
yes.
Racism, I'm reading this from the CDC website. Racism is a system consisting of structures, policies, practices, and norms that assigns value and determines opportunity based on the way people look or the color of their skin. A growing body of research shows that centuries of racism in this country has had a profound and negative impact on communities of color. The impact is pervasive and deeply embedded in our society, affecting where one lives, learns, works, worships, and plays, and creating inequities in access to a range of social and economic benefits, such as housing, education, wealth, and employment. These conditions, often referred to as social determinants of health, are the key drivers of health inequities within communities of color, placing those within these populations at a greater risk for poor health outcomes. And then you write in your book, I worry about my clients and I worry about the link between police violence and early deaths among Black Americans. Violent and aggressive policing not only increases the risk of fatal injuries, but also reduces life expectancy among Black youth and adults who live with chronic stress and extended trauma. When faced with a threat, the body activates defense systems and produces stress hormones, such as cortisol, that are necessary for survival. The fight, flight, freeze response, which is the body's natural reaction to danger, is often accompanied by an accelerated heartbeat, inflammation, and rapid and shallow breathing. When the threat is persistent or recurring, such as with racial discrimination, police violence, or the fear of such violence, the survival process causes rapid wear and tear on body organs and can lead to diabetes, strokes, ulcers, cognitive impairment, autoimmune disorders, high blood pressure, accelerated aging, and death. Now, if that's not one reason or 50 reasons for us to come together and say, this has got to end, I don't know what is, right? And my husband and I always talk about, we don't see racism ending in our lifetime. But to have the CDC say that, you talk about it in your book, we know that kids who are living and experience violence on a day-to-day basis, what they go through emotionally, physically, mentally is just, it's just traumatic, right? It's trauma. Yeah. And I want you to just address that just in terms of, you know, you say, looking at your clients, that you feel you're scared for your clients. I mean, you're scared for Black people because of all of these things that have occurred. And we've seen with the pandemic, what that has done to Black people, Latino people, Native American people, because of all of the other stuff that we're dealing with, right? All the other stressors that we deal with in community, all the other trauma, all the disease that we have because of the trauma. So talk a little bit, even though you're not a medical doctor, you understand how these things are all interrelated and how you then have to go into a courtroom and defend a client who may have had some traumatic experiences, and the reason why they acted up or did whatever that they did was because of X, something that happened previous.
So, you know, I mean, there's again, so much you could say in response to that. I mean, we could look at this trauma question from the front end and from the back end, right? And so that from the front end, I think about the intersection between trauma and policing. For most people, not most people, but for many people in this country, policing relieves trauma, right? So we think about, oh, if I'm in a traumatic situation of like, I live in a violent community, let me call the police in to reduce crime. Or, police might come in to remove an abusive parent, or, to resolve some conflict. So for many kids, particularly for white kids, policing relieves trauma. But for Black kids, it exacerbates trauma in so many ways. I mean, think about historically, police officers have been called upon throughout American history to reinforce or to enforce the most traumatic stages of Black brutality, or brutality against Blacks, right? So to enforce slavery, right? To resist the integration efforts during the civil rights movement, right? So police have always been called on or relied on to enforce and exacerbate the traumas that Black folks experience. And so now, of course, as Black parents, we have no choice but to give our children the talk and say, look, whatever you do, get home safe. And what that does is, not only is it a survival mechanism, but it's also reinforcing and passing along generation for generation the fears and the trauma that are associated with policing, right? So that's that front end work, that policing in and of itself. And what I was surprised to learn, Angela, as I started doing this work for the book, the research for the book, finding the growing body of research documenting the extraordinary trauma that Black children experience in the mere presence of police, right? Fear, anxiety, depression, hopelessness, all of those things. So that's front end side. And then
I have that as an adult.
Yes, right, exactly. And imagine that level of trauma as an adolescent and what it does to healthy growth and healthy adolescent development. So that's all front end. And then you're talking about this, sort of back end, that we don't have a trauma-informed justice system. Right? And I don't even like to use the word justice system. We don't have a trauma-informed legal system. And so when people, children, poor people who've lived in violent communities come in, they've gotten swept up in crime or, victims of crime, whatever it is, we don't have a trauma-informed system that recognizes or that provides rehabilitative services or rehabilitative responses to young people in the juvenile legal system. So somebody who gets arrested, we're not giving them counselors, mental health. Instead, we're putting them in solitary confinement, right? You treat them, you beat them, and you treat them, terribly. You tell them they're not worth it. And then they begin to act out and respond in ways that are consistent with that. And then you want to beat them some more for being for responding the way we are. So we're really, tremendous trauma on the front end, and then not trauma informed on the back end at all.
Yeah. So I don't want to leave without saying that you do have some solutions in the book. It's not just all just not, you guys are doing the wrong things. There is a solution. One of the things you say is implicit bias training cannot be abstract and theoretical, but must instead be grounded in the experiences of the participating officers and tailored to the unique issues that arise in policing Black youth. One study found that individuals can reduce their implicit bias over time by relying on strategies like stereo replacement, counter stereotyping imaging, individualization, perspective taking, and increasing opportunities for positive contact with people of color. Yeah. I so agree that we have so much to learn about how we go about getting rid of the implicit bias, whether through policing, that it's not just sitting there in a classroom, it's really interacting, role playing, and really coming up with ideas and suggestions on how police interact in community. Yeah. And we know this stems from slave, catchers back in them. We know it's just a continuation of that. So if you want to address that a little bit, and then I'll close with one final thing.
Yeah. So I mean, before we even get to like training, my number one takeaway is we have to radically reduce the presence of police officers in the lives of children, all children, and especially Black children who've been disproportionately targeted. So, some of those remedies include, police-free schools, right? And it's not as radical as it sounds. It means we just need to figure out where we need police, where police officers are best trained, and limit them to those parameters. Police aren't well trained to go into schools, right? They're not trained in adolescent development. And to be quite frank, so many police officers, when they're honest with you, they want to be relieved of some of the tasks and responsibilities that they've been given, right? They don't want to intervene in cases involving folks with mental illness, right? They don't want to be babysitters for children in school and the like. So we really need to reduce the presence of police. And there are many other strategies that I talk about in that. But then when in the rare circumstances, right, allow police to work on that small body of offenses that are those violent offenses, and that's it, right? And then the vast majority of offenses, people don't know this, that are for which kids are referred to juvenile court are normal adolescent behaviors or low-level nonviolent offenses. And so we need to get police out of that. But in the rare circumstances when we do need police in contact with young people, then they need to be trained, right? They need to be trained on adolescent development, de-escalation strategies, implicit bias in a meaningful way, in which you said, and we need to hold police officers accountable, right? For their engagement with young people. And that starts with having comprehensive and clear regulations that prohibit use of force on Black children. We should never talk about pepper spraying a 9-year-old girl. We shouldn't even have to write a regulation. It's unconscionable, right? Handcuffing children under the age of 12. I mean, the list goes on. Using dogs, yes, canine dogs in some parts of the country on children, body slam procedures, all these things that we, have heard about. So there needs to be sort of really a comprehensive set of regulations and accountability and training for officers in those rare circumstances where we do need police engaged. And then the final thing that I will say is really about what we all can do for kids. And I think Bruce, before he left, made a comment about we are an incredible people. We can get away from trauma. Here's the answer to this. A psychologist friend once said to me, and I've never forgotten it, every single child needs one irrationally caring adult. And a child will be far better off if they have a team of irrationally caring adults. Somebody who looks at them and says, I know you have made a mistake and you will make mistakes, but I'm going to stick by you. I'm going to support you. I'm going to redirect you, but I'm going to support you. I'm going to show you grace and tolerance. And, and we as a country have to do that individually and then collectively by investing our dollars in young people, in communities, and in families, and not in traditional law enforcement responses and surveillance. So.
Agree. Thank you. That is excellent. One last thing. No, people are hopping off because we've been on for an hour, but we could talk probably about this for hours and hours. But you mentioned Lil Baby in in your book, and I saw that and I said, wow, Kristen Henning is listening to Lil Baby. I wonder if he knows that you're listening. listening to some of his rap.
Exactly.
Honestly, I worked at NACDL, and right before I left, we had this event in Atlanta, and Lil Baby was on a panel discussion that I moderated. And I teased him at first because he had these huge diamonds in his ears, and he's just a little kid, and I don't know a lot of contemporary rap. I know like old school, like Houdini.
Right. Okay, that's
Tribe Called Quest, because I'm Brooklyn.
Right.
But so asking him questions, and one of the things he talked about was the bias that he experienced from Black people also in his community. But you mentioned his rap, this song in your book. And so I went and I looked up the lyrics because I was trying to listen to it, but it's he raps so fast.
Right.
I said, let me pull up the lyrics and read them slow, because I'm over 50. So in the rap, he says, I can't lie like I don't rap about killing and dope, but I'm telling youngins to vote. I did what I did because I have no choice or no hope. I was forced to jump in and go. This BS is all that I know, but it's time for a change.
Yeah.
Got time to be serious, no time for games. We ain't taking no more. Let us go from them chains. God bless they souls, every one of them names. It's bigger than black and white. It's a problem with the whole way of life. It can't change overnight, but we got to start somewhere. Might as well go ahead, start here. We done had a hell of a year. I'ma make it count while I'm here. God is the only man I fear. And that's just part of the lyrics I pull from that. I highly suggest everybody just go and try to listen to the song. It's called The Bigger Picture.
Yep.
But I thought that that was so apropos to end with that. When you think about Jordan Davis playing rap,
Yep.
this guy who doesn't know anything or can't understand why people listen to rap or play rap. Some rap is, like this Little Baby song where he's like talking about, okay, giving us the power, going to vote, get us out of the chains.
Yes.
Let's not forget the names of those who have died. I thought was just so apropos. So thank you for including Lil Baby. And again,
Yes.
I hope he knows that you have included
I
him.
know we need to send it to him. I'm sending it to him, right?
Actually, I know his lawyer, so I'm gonna send
There
him
we go.
his lawyer message and say, hey, do you know this? So thank you again so much. I really, really appreciate it. I know you are talking to a lot of people and the book is great. I highly suggest everybody go get The Rage of Innocence. And yes, thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's been a phenomenal conversation. Really, I love your insights and your approach and the things that resonated with you, right? As a Black woman, right? Are much of what resonates with me. So I appreciate you.
Thank you.